So hello everyone, my name is Heather Doran and I am the Secretary of PCST, and I'm going to be hosting this webinar session today. We're going to hear from a number of speakers. It's great that many of you have found the chat already, so that's great. Please use the chat function to post some questions and comments as we run through the webinar. I'll let everybody know that this webinar is also being recorded and it will be posted online after the recording is finished, and the recording will also have subtitles with it when it's posted onto YouTube. You can also catch up with all of the other PCST webinars that you might have missed on the YouTube channel as well, so they're all available there. So I'm your host today. If you haven't used Zoom before, you can find chat if you click on the three dots that say more at the bottom of your screen, and you should get a menu and you can find the chat function there, but hopefully it has appeared for everyone on the screen. So this webinar today is going to be talking about lots of different themes related to acknowledgement, inclusivity, diversity, and recognition. I'm not going to say too much within this webinar at the start, and I'm here to facilitate the conversation. So I'm going to give a chance for all of our speakers. We've got a great lineup of speakers today. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Emily Dawson, is unable to join us, but we're going to have a great discussion. So I'm going to hand over to them to introduce themselves, a little bit about their reasons why they're here, and a little bit about what they do as well to set the context for this discussion. So I think I'm going to hand over to Alice first. If you want to speak first, that would be great.
Thanks, Heather, and thanks everybody for being here with probably lots of odd hours of the day and night. My name is Alice Fleerackers, and I'm a member of the scientific committee at PCST, as well as a PhD student, actually candidate, at Simon Fraser University, where I study health and science journalism. I'm actually joining you today from my university's downtown Vancouver campus, which is based on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, which are three Indigenous groups here in British Columbia. I also want to acknowledge that I live as a settler and an immigrant in Chotlich, which is a little bit farther from here, and is also unceded territory, but of the Shishal Nation. For those of you who are unfamiliar with territorial acknowledgements, such as these, today is going to be an opportunity to learn a bit more about what they are and why they matter, and how we see them as factoring into a larger conversation about equity, inclusion, diversity, and accessibility in science communication, and specifically at PCST. I'll turn it over maybe to Siddharth.
Thanks, Alice. Hello, everyone. My name is Siddharth Kankaria, and I am a science communication researcher, practitioner, and teacher from India. I currently work as the communication and program manager at National Center for Biological Sciences in India. And I am a cisgendered man with some privileges, also a first-generation brown queer person with a hidden disability. And I believe that my life experiences play a very important role in terms of my approach towards understanding science and society, including science communication. I'm really sort of passionate about thinking of science communication as a tool for social justice. And that's my main motivation for being here today and engaging in a conversation with all of you. I'll now hand it over to Tibise.
Thank you, Siddharth, and also thank you, Alice, for sharing the territorial acknowledgement. I'm Tibise Sankating-Nava. I'm a researcher and a public engagement coordinator from Aruba in the Caribbean, and I was asked to reflect on the statement today during this webinar, together with Emily Dawson, who, as Heather mentioned, unfortunately can't join us today. So I've worked in public engagement in the Netherlands in Europe for nearly 10 years. And I currently work at the Royal Netherlands Institute for Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies as part of research programs focused on the Caribbean islands, among other things, climate change and heritage. And I echo Siddharth in that I also want to reflect on how these experiences shape how I look at the world and how I look at my work. And while this experience of working in this field in Europe for the past 10 years have been fundamental to my embodied awareness of the inequalities in research, and of the role of academic research, specifically in the Caribbean. And this led me to an ongoing critical reflection on my own ambiguous position within Dutch academia. So my research and my practice focus on this ambiguity and more thematically, specifically on the co-creation of research with Caribbean island community.
Okay,
Heather.
thank you. Thank you very much for those introductions to everyone. We thought it was really important to set the scene about who's speaking today and really kind of bring us into this webinar. So I'm going to now pass back over to Alice, who's going to share a little bit more about the reasons why this webinar has come to fruition and some of the topics of discussion for today.
Thank you. I might just start by briefly sharing my screen to introduce you to this amazing resource. It's called nativeland.ca, which is a way of seeing all of the Indigenous communities and territories where you may be based. And so you can see I'm in what's known as British Columbia, sort of around here, I believe. No, yes, somewhere around here, right by the Fraser River. And you can just see scrolling over how many different diverse Indigenous groups have traditionally and continue to call these places home. So maybe Heather could paste this link in the chat if she has it handy. And you can start to explore where you're based. You may or may not be based on Indigenous territory. You may be based on multiple. There's also links here where you can start to explore a bit about the cultures and visit the websites of these groups. So with that in mind, I want to expand a bit more on how I started today, which was with a brief territorial acknowledgement. Territorial acknowledgements have sort of become customary in Canada. They're a way of acknowledging the Indigenous peoples who are the rightful and traditional guardians of the lands where we live and work. And they're also just a small part of Canada's attempts to reconcile and repair a very troubling relationship with Indigenous peoples. These peoples have long called these lands home, but their ancestors, cultures, languages, and traditions have been systematically attacked and suppressed by colonizers and settlers, including sort of some of probably my ancestors, if you were to look back long enough. And I want to take a little bit of time to also expand on that statement I offered at the beginning where I talked a little bit about where I'm based. And I acknowledged that this university where I'm zooming in from today is based on land that was essentially stolen from Indigenous peoples. But sort of ironically, this university is also named after a man named Simon Fraser, who was a fur trader and a founder of the first European settlements in British Columbia, this region. So in other words, this university is named after the first colonizer of the region that's now known as BC. Although he didn't stay here in this very specific area very long, his actions are now recognized as the beginning of a colonial process of dispossession and settlement in this region, which, as I mentioned, is part of a much wider effort to eradicate and basically destroy Indigenous peoples who have lived here in what we call Canada for thousands of years. As a white person and a settler and an immigrant on these lands, I am trying very hard to repair my relationships and build sort of some trust and reciprocity with the Indigenous peoples and cultures, which, as I mentioned, have been and continue to be marginalized and oppressed by settler colonial culture. I'm also trying to reconcile at the same time sort of the deeply problematic and colonial history of my birth country, which is Belgium, and as many of you may know, has sort of brutally attempted to turn what's now known as the Democratic Republic of Canada into a model colony. I am not an expert in this space, and I really want to stress that. But I come here to this conversation as a learner, somebody who wants to become more educated and become more capable of taking actions towards addressing these colonial histories and working towards a future of science communication and just actually future societies that are more inclusive, decolonial, equitable, accessible, and welcoming of diversity. And so participating in webinars like this is just one example of that commitment or that action. And this sort of sense of action is a really big part of making these statements and these acknowledgements. We don't just want to acknowledge, we also want to take some steps to correct, which I believe Siddharth is going to speak a little bit more about. And so this statement that we're talking about today in this webinar is again sort of one step towards that vision of a more equitable future for science communication and for our organization. And it's very much a draft. This is not a finished piece. We really want you to be here and be part of a conversation that will refine and build upon this statement. This statement, which perhaps Heather can paste in the chat if she hasn't already, emerged as part of a conversation, maybe part of many conversations between Siddharth and myself when we were organizing a webinar last year about teaching as a way to bridge research and practice in science communication. At that time, Siddharth and I were very concerned about how to make this webinar more inclusive, not just of our diverse speakers, some of whom were not as comfortable speaking in English than others, but also of the participants and audience members who would attend. And so including a territorial acknowledgement at the start of the webinar, one sort of similar to the one I started today with, was just one of several actions we took to make people feel welcome, including having a simultaneous translation to Spanish, including using the chat to reiterate important points in English, in writing so that people could understand, as well as some other actions. I also really want to acknowledge that my whole understanding of Indigenous territorial acknowledgements and of sort of our history as a field of science and of communication in relation to sort of excluding and marginalizing Indigenous forms of knowledge and storytelling. All of this knowledge and all of this learning I've been doing is very much informed by my conversations with Ashley Edwards of Métis Nation BC, who is our Indigenous subject librarian here at SFU. I just owe her so much, and I feel it's important to acknowledge her. She's been such a support and resource in helping me navigate what's really complicated. And finally, I want to just sort of frame this, like notice that this acknowledgement also wasn't just something me and Siddharth came up with and popped into this conversation, but was also part of a conversation with members of the scientific committee. And it was actually those committee members who suggested that we should have a webinar today as a way to gather your perspectives, our members, and ensure that this statement will actually reflect the things that matter to you and the way that we as a group are committed to making science communication and our organization more inclusive. And with that, I'll pass it over to Siddharth.
Thank you so much, Alice, for sharing that overview of how we came about to the statement. As I said, I'm someone who lives in India, a nation which has been historically colonized, and my experiences with colonization and similar marginalizations has mostly been through historical documents and textbooks, and even my schooling and education system, which has really, the narrative in India about colonization is very much from our perspective and how it was wronged and how it was very, very sort of an atrocity. But I'm also very aware that there are many, many layers of marginalization. And this is something that we really felt was important to address. So as Alice was mentioning, when we had done the webinar and we had sort of included a territorial acknowledgement and we had taken care of including some measures to make sure that people, one of our panelists or anybody who was not very comfortable speaking in English had enough of sort of extra measures taken so that they felt comfortable. And so not only did we sort of have a closed captioning and simultaneous interpretation during our webinar, we also made sure that we had enough chats with the panelist who was not comfortable in English so that we could make sure that they could send us their answers in written and we could give feedback to them. And it was a conversation that we really undertook. After the webinar, I think we really felt that it was important to share our learnings from the webinar with the larger PCST community. And so we sent this as an email to some of the people of the scientific committee, particularly Jenny and Michelle. That was the starting point of a conversation where a lot of inputs started coming in. And once we shared these webinar accessibility measures that we thought were sort of useful for the community, we also had a larger conversation on territorial acknowledgement. And I remember at that point, there was one thing that I felt very particularly about, which was that territorial acknowledgement is something which makes a lot of sense for settler colonial societies like Canada or US or New Zealand and Australia, but it is relatively an alien concept in countries like India. Even though we've had a very brutal tryst with colonialism ourselves, it is not something that we really use or think about or even talk about in India. And so we, through our conversations with in these email chains, we realized that the territorial acknowledgement was a very important aspect that we wanted to include on the PCSC website, but alone it was not enough. It had to be supplemented with something a lot more. And so in some ways, we wanted to broaden the scope of the statement to also include some more intangible aspects of colonialism and other historical marginalizations, right? And obviously, we could not do this, and we did not want to do this by ourselves. And so this webinar was very much a response to sort of basically an effective way to collect feedback and inputs and co-create a statement that everybody felt sort of address their views, their context, and their needs in terms of what a diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusivity statement should do for the PCST organization. And we really hope that you all would contribute in terms of your inputs and your criticism and your feedback in terms of how we can make this more inclusive. Lastly, I just want to add that the statement, it's very easy for the statement to say that, just add a territorial acknowledgement or say that we want to work towards diversity, inclusivity, equity, and accessibility. But we wanted to make sure that the statement also had an actionable sort of point, and that we were holding ourselves accountable in some way in terms of doing more, right? And this, I think, is a very important segue into all the activities that PCST wants to do in the future in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusivity also. So we are not saying that the statement is sort of the end all or sort of the end point of what we want to do about DEI initiatives. It is very much the first stepping stone in terms of making sure that we are moving towards a direction where we are accessing diversity, equity, inclusivity, accessibility, and most importantly, social justice aspects of how we should be doing science communication and how science communication can be used as a tool for social justice, how it can be used to make science more accessible to communities which may not have access to it historically or, in general. So I think those are the things that I really wanted to touch upon, and I'll now pass on the mic to Tibise so she could share her reflections. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Siddharth and Alice, for that introduction and for shedding some light on the process so far. I thought it was so beautiful what you said. The statement is the first stepping stone towards science communication as a tool for social justice. Beautiful. I was asked, as I said, to reflect on the statement today during this webinar. And to me, the statement, and also from the introduction by Alice and Siddharth, immediately raises a question, I think, for all of us. Yes, we heard the word action. So where are we trying to go as a field when it comes to inclusion, intersectionality, and social justice? I will try to give one perspective on this, and I hope that we'll be able to have a broader conversation and listen to reflections by more members who are present today. But I'll start with a brief reflection. So in JCOM in 2020, maybe you've read it, Lindy Orthia argues that science communicators must take steps to radically reform their understandings of science communication so that people from diverse cultures, nations, and traditions can genuinely own it as theirs. And I think this is one of the challenges that we face and that this collective statement makes the first step towards. A critical part of the process of building a more inclusive field is to recognize also what Alice highlighted, to recognize how colonial legacies of scientific research have contributed to the appropriation of land and have ridiculed oral traditions, local languages, ways of knowing. very often rendering them valueless or inconsequential, specifically in relation to this way of knowing that we call science and the scientific method. So what are we as science communicators then doing when we communicate science or when we lead or study different forms of public engagement? Are we reflecting on these colonial legacies, or are we maybe strengthening this way of doing research? Are we perpetuating this violence? And to me, these are the kinds of questions that this statement invites us to consider as a network. Sorry. So yeah, as PCST, I think it's logical that our focus is on public engagement with science. However, I think it's also inevitable, and we see that today, that we also reflect upon science and the research practice more generally. We can't consider transforming science communication without critically reflecting upon those structures and the practices that academic research is built on and continues to perpetuate. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm from the Caribbean. We see this in the Caribbean where I'm from, but I expect that colleagues around the world may recognize this in different ways in their countries and their communities. So this statement, this draft statement, can be a first step to the critical interrogation of science communication and its role in strengthening scientific research and perpetuating these underlying structures. So how do we move as a field in a changing world? I would love to have that conversation together also in this group. And then more concretely, I think when we talk about this statement, and especially the actions that we will take as a network, that hopefully will come up with some of these ideas or some of these first thoughts collectively. For me, I would like us to also reflect on the dynamics of decision-making in science communication and in public engagement. And what do I mean by that? Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, who writes a lot about decolonizing research, among other things, points to pertinent questions that can be asked about research that I think are also very relevant to science communication. Things like, who is the research for? Who are the owners of the research? Who will benefit from it? Who will carry the research out? Who will disseminate it? So yeah, very basically, who funds, designs, leads, executes, communicates, and benefits from our work as science communicators, public engagement professionals, researchers. And I think as the PCST network, we can create space for our members to critically reflect on these questions and on their own background, on our position and our training, to be able to recognize how this influences our work and the choices that we make in the field. For me personally, it's a practice of also continuously asking myself how we can build a research and public engagement practice that is more grounded locally, that is more embedded in questions relevant to our communities, and that equitably involves stakeholders outside academia as well. And I think these profound changes can lead to a more inclusive and intersectional and locally contextualized practice that in the end has more impact as well. So just to wrap it up, I believe that the session today was meant also as a way for members to reflect on, to discuss, to expand and fine-tune the statement. So I really hope that my reflection is the first of many, and I'm very curious to hear what the other participants think. So maybe Heather, can I pass the mic back to you?
Thank you all very much for setting the scene and explaining so eloquently and fully all of the different kind of factors and things that play into the conversation that we're hoping to have today. So encourage people to please offer your reflections and questions in the chat. We have copied and pasted a short and long version of the statement. So please take some time to have a read of that. I have also got some resources that were gathered by Alice and Siddharth to share, but I won't do that just yet because I don't want to move the statement too far up the chat as people are considering it. So I'll keep those towards the end of this discussion. But I think some of the points that, all of the points are really interesting, but one of the things that I've picked up on is some of those final comments, I think, around how focusing research kind of locally and having that local grounding, whereas we have PCST as a global network. So how those two different areas can come together, how PCST could support that in practice. I also think there's an interesting kind of relationship between the role PCST plays and then the focus of the funders that people are working with locally as well, and the systems there and how those areas can come together. So I'm just keeping my eye on the chat as well. I was going to mention, Anna Claudia's mentioned around the space, room, time at the PCST conference in Rotterdam. There will be a lot of conversations on this topic and focused areas relating to this topic in Rotterdam within the programme to keep the conversation going. I don't have the final version of the programme yet to share with you, to point you to that, but please do keep an eye on that. And Jemana, yes, you've issued a comment in the chat. The statement is a step that needs to lead towards actions. Having other webinars of how science communicators are working, considering IDEA, may help us improve the way we work. Could you maybe comment on the PCST conference program? Okay, similar question, and how is it considered that? So yeah, the focus of the conference is also relating to this topic, and so there will be lots of conversation around that. And like I say, I don't have, there is a draft program that I think has been shared, but there isn't a final program yet. So I can't tell you the exact times and places to go because they might change, but do keep an eye on that. And this is definitely, again, as we mentioned, a starting point in the conversation of where we take things next. I think, Alberta, do you have your hand up there? Were you hoping to speak?
Hello, good.
Hi.
Hello, good morning from where I am.
Good morning.
Yes. Thanks very much for the session. But I'm coming from the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago in particular, Trinidad in particular of the Twin Island Republic. One of the things that drew me to be passionate about communicating science in my region of the world is because there is a situation where you would find that there is greater access to knowing the results of research from countries outside of the Caribbean region. And so you will hear a report from a study that, in Oxford, or let's say Harvard Business School, or etc., etc. And it's not to say that these studies may not be done in a proper way, but it may have no relevance for the nuance of the Caribbean or the nuance of Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, there would be research going on Trinidad and Tobago, and the people in Trinidad and Tobago that would have relevance, maybe more relevance, and is to be able to communicate that and to get that research out to those who need to be more aware of it, and also to bring them into the conversation. So that's the kind of champion background I'm coming from. And so linked to that now, I think it's very important that the statement not just only acknowledge Indigenous persons, or we would call them First Peoples, but it needs to acknowledge, and I will put in a broad bracket, enslaved people who were forced or had semi-choice in coming to regions which they form the backbone of. I think that needs to be acknowledged in the statement up front, and not just left as the word colonial, but say in a similar way that the Indigenous people were acknowledged. I think we need to acknowledge the enslaved, and I'm calling it very broadly because enslaved, for my context, will broadly include those who were brought via slavery and those who were brought via indentureship. So slavery would probably mainly be Africa, and indentureship would mainly be let's say, India. So I think that acknowledgement is important because these persons went on to form Indigenous, and the enslaved went on to form the backbone of certain countries that are now labeled as third world. And I think we need to acknowledge that group as well, especially because also there's a heavy trust now with the concept of reparation. And that is a heavy concept and action that is presently being championed by the University of the West Indies, which goes across the Caribbean, the chancellor of the university. So I think that group needs to be acknowledged along with the Indigenous. That's what I would like to say as an initial statement.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think these are incredibly important points to consider. I didn't know if any of the panelists wanted to make any comment on that at all. I saw Alice nodding a lot when you were speaking. So I didn't know if you wanted to add a few words.
Sorry. Yeah, sure. I do think, I was nodding a lot because I think it makes so much sense. And I think this is one of the most challenging things that we talked a lot about, is how do you make an acknowledgement that's representative of a global network where each of these countries has such a different history of colonization, oppression, enslavement. And I think that was one reason why actually Siddharth and I, our preferred version of the statement is actually that longer one that he pasted in the chat, where we are not just acknowledging the lands where many of our members are based, but also really explicitly recognizing the exclusionary history of our field. And perhaps also we should acknowledge present of our field. This is not a dead issue of the past. It's also something we continue to do. And I think TPSI you were really reiterating that and saying let's reflect on where our research is now and how we might be contributing to a practice and way of gathering and sharing knowledge. And to what Alberta said too, what's the knowledge that gets communicated even today that's very exclusionary. So I do wonder, especially in a space like our website, where we have quite a lot of space and we could include a much more detailed statement, whether maybe building on this longer statement to include some of the points that Alberta just raised and that others may also raise today, might be a better way to portray sort of a holistic approach to equity and inclusion.
Yeah, thanks, Alice. Oh, Siddharth, you put your hand up. Do you want to come in with a few words?
Yeah, I just want to quickly sort of add on to what Alice said. I completely agree with her, of course. I think I just want to quote a line from the detailed version of the statement that we wrote, because I think it really captures what Alice was trying to say, is that we deeply recognize the deeply colonial, racist, gendered, cis heteronormative, able-bodied, neurotypical, Eurocentric, Anglophone, exclusionary history of our field. And the point here is that we can never include everything that is there. But I think Alberta's point is very, very genuine. And I think if we can sort of work with her in terms of to sort of write a statement which does include what she's trying to say, I think it's very challenging, as Alice said, to sort of capture everybody's experience and sort of history of how marginalization or exclusion has happened and how it sort of also has I mean, there are many ways and many factors in which it continues to operate in our world today, right? We may not be aware of it because it's not active, but it is sort of a product of what has happened in the past. So I think there is a nexus of power, privilege, proximity, identity, sort of how you look and how you behave and where you live, all of which feeds into sort of how we experience the world, right? And this is exactly why we want everyone to pitch in. So I just want to say thank you, Alberta, for sharing those experiences and that very valid sort of point of view. And we'll try our best to sort of incorporate that as far as we can. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I noticed as well that Claire has written a comment within the chat which relates to, I think respect is particularly pertinent at a conference. Have been thoughts about how this might also influence any guidance on conduct for PCST, for instance, making sure people ask questions in a respectful way or develop presentations and activities to be mindful of these points. I can bring a little bit of background to that relating to the PCST conference. I was involved as one of the co-hosts for the Aberdeen conference that was virtual. We instigated a code of conduct for that conference. In the end, we were virtual, but that has been carried forward for this conference as well. So there is a code of conduct there. It is possible that that could be stronger. I don't know, Claire, if you've seen that at all, but it would be good maybe to have a discussion around that and maybe a reflection after the conference on the role that played, if any, and the awareness of that code of conduct and other things that could be included within that. So I think that's a really important point as well that we could take forward. And I think that kind of links into the question that I wanted to pose at this point, is beyond the statement. We've all mentioned the fact that the statement isn't the end. It's not just about giving a statement and then that is kind of complete, but what actions could and may PCST take to support this work and back up the statement that's made. So we're really interested in people's thoughts on that and what they would like to see PCST doing. I can see there's more messages coming in as I'm talking as well, and I don't know if any of our panelists would like to come back in on that point after I pose that question. I'll give you a minute. Yeah, Alice, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, I mean, sure. So I can actually mention that one of the comments that was just put in the chat was from Lisbeth about how, yeah, like DEIA or whatever acronym we want to use is a part of the conference theme, so will be part of the content of the conference. And Siddharth put a few sessions in there that will be directly addressing this topic, but she also suggested sort of setting up a working group that can work on this particular statement, and I would suggest also like potentially building off of this statement to consider other forms of equity inclusion. And I want to say, I think that's a really good idea. The scientific committee has all these subcommittees that are responsible for different things at PCST, like I'm on the social media committee. So once in a while, I am responsible for tweeting and posting resources on Facebook. But I have had some conversations with other members earlier, like I guess last year, about more broadly, like why don't we have an equity committee? And like can't if this is important to us, I think that the structure of our sort of leadership team, or it's sort of the team that's supposed to be pushing forward and making sure that all of you are represented well in the direction of the organization. I think we really need to have that formal structure where it's not just something that every team is doing off the side of their desk in addition to their other responsibilities, even though, of course, everybody should be thinking about this in everything that they do. But somebody needs to be accountable to pushing it forward and then making sure that webinars like this happen. So yes, in short, +1 to this idea, but also let's take it further beyond the conference, beyond the statement, to consider more broadly, like how can we take more actions and continue this learning journey and this journey towards the future that we want to see.
Can I just pitch in for a minute? I completely agree with Alice, as always. And I think it's a great idea that the leadership of PCST should reflect their commitment and sort of their intention to work on these issues. And I think it's a wonderful idea to have a DEI subcommittee or whatever it's called. And I just wanted to say that it is something that has to be done in a sustained and long-term manner. DEI is not something that you organize one event in a year or every month, or it cannot be and it shouldn't be a touch and go sort of affair. It is always meant to be a long-term thing. And I think there has to be a strong component of both action and impact that can be measured in terms of DEI. Otherwise, DEI is not meaningful. And I've been in a lot of conversations around decolonization also, which is another sort of connected aspect. And I think it's important to remember that DEI is not just about inclusion or adding more marginalized voices. It's also about breaking down structures which are hegemonic, which are systematically sort of troubling or troublesome. So I think there has to be a balance between creation and destruction in a constructive way, of course. And I just want to remind everyone in this session that it's not just about doing more, it's also about breaking down, reflecting, sort of toning down or sort of reducing what we have and thinking how we can do that better. So I just wanted to leave that for people to reflect on.
Thank you very much for, again, bringing up many important points. Yeah, a balance between creation and destruction. Yeah. So those are all really, really important points. I've also posted some of those resources that I mentioned earlier into the chat now as well. Those will be kind of saved and shared as well. And those are things that people could look at as individuals, whether maybe after we finish this webinar. I was also trying to look to see if I could find the code of conduct to post that into the chat, but I'm trying to juggle too many screens, I think, at once at this point in time, relating to the conference. So I think that's a really important thing we could pick up afterwards as well. I just wondered if anyone else had any comments that they wanted to post within the chat or around the actions that we want to see PCST taking. Oh, I see Alberta has got hand up as well. Alberta, did you want to come back in?
Okay, I could talk for the moment. I'm not able to put on my video. I don't know if you need for me to put it on. Okay. All right, thanks again for the opportunity. Just to start off first with the actions. Sometimes things might be done in a complicated way when it's just the simple things that need to be done. And like as Siddharth and Alice would have mentioned about just having other alternatives to be able to communicate with the content. So for me personally, again, coming from this side of the region and realizing that there may be a lot of the whole science communication persons, if I'm wrong, well, it's okay, but science communication persons over the ocean. I think what I just feel might be needed is that I know we have webinars, and I think it would be good just to, anytime we have webinars, have a 5 minutes or 10 minutes that persons could just speed date, just be put in a random Zoom room with other people and just meet people, because being quite on this side of the globe, it's not like if I could take a train and go up to Spain or go to England and meet somebody. I have to kind of like depend on sometimes these opportunities to the technology to meet persons. And because persons are busy, if they're in a webinar, at least you're sure you have them. So I think just that's a simple way to have inclusivity, is to provide a platform for people to communicate with one another, to always having some type of 5-minute, 10-minute where people could chat with one another, meet new persons, because you never know through that interaction. Because I mean, even if it have a first world and third world, the fact is people is people, and people could help one another. So I think just doing that, because it's not just the content and the knowledge, it's the connection. And to connect with people, you need time. You need a time to get it done. And so that's one of my immediate suggestions. And as we said, again, the time zone situation, even if the small, like the Africa Americas, could have their sub-webinar, etc., etc. So you get to at least meet people within your time zone, within your region. All those little things could help, because diversity, inclusion, the whole DEIA is not something you say, it's something you do. So it's the little actions that you take. I think it's really important sometimes to understand culture. And so, again, excuse me if I'm wrong, but, you know, sometimes people from other cultures will feel that by having a set of statements and rules, we will keep things in check. And for other cultures, it would be like, so I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't do the next, what I can do? You know, so even in coming up with rules, we have to make sure that the same rules don't quench people's ability to do things. Because in some cultures, like say Latin American culture, kissing on the cheek, that is nothing. You know, that's how they greet one another. So even in putting a rule about being careful about your interaction, you have to remember that some cultures, that type of interaction does not mean anything. You know, it's nothing negative. So you always have to keep considering how people do things, even when we trying to have certain things done. I don't know if I explained myself well, but that's all I'll say for the hour.
Thank you. No, yeah, that was very, very clear, and I noticed lots of people are quoting what you said in the chat as well, which is really, really, really fantastic. I think that the points around connections really important, and networking. We maybe I shouldn't forget, and I think Alberta, you experienced these. We tried some virtual networking during the PCST conference in 2020+1, which was virtual, and we should remember that balance between kind of what the virtual platforms can enable us to do, and then where the limits are as well, in terms of making sure that we've got opportunities for people to connect. And I think expanding that on the webinars is a really, really kind of powerful and interesting thing to consider. I will come in at this point just to mention a few things around PCST and the structure, because I see as well it's been mentioned in the chat, and I think Alice has been put forward there, which I'm sure she'll be happy about. I'm not gonna but yeah, the scientific committee is voted on every 2 years at the conference, and half of the committee changes at that point. So the elections will be coming up for new committee members. The submissions closed on the 1st of March. And so basically half of the scientific committee potentially for PCST potentially will change. And it's a scientific committee that make decisions about the running of PCST and what's taken forward. They're also the people that give their time to run PCST. So it's a completely kind of voluntary organization. And there are a number of because it's a registered entity, so there's a number of kind of responsibilities that the network has in order to maintain that status as well. So I would encourage people to take a look at the PCST constitution as well that exists, and I can link to that in the chat in a minute, because that might be an area as well that needs to be kind of addressed and looked at in terms of what we're talking about, of kind of barriers that might exist, or kind of the support that exists within that structure to enable people to participate. So I think that might be also something to take forward. But the comments, suggestions, ideas and feedback from this webinar as well will be make sure that the incoming scientific committee is aware of these and brings those into the discussions that they have. So I just wanted to mention that in terms of next steps as well, and the status of PCST at the minute. I didn't know if anyone else wanted to come in and give some comments at the minute. The chat is kind of going faster than I can keep up with in terms of comments, which is great. So I don't think there's any questions that have been posed for our panelists that I've seen. There's lots of positive comments.
Heather, can I suggest something before we close? Yeah. Could we agree on a few set of action points that we want to follow up, and so that we at least have some sort of a conclusion in terms of where are we, how are we going forward? I've
got these jotted down in terms of things we've kind of brought together and people have come. Yep. So I want to just give one final chance for people to bring anything else forward.
Sorry,
that they'd like to raise at this point. Everyone's gone quiet. TBC, I don't know if you wanted to come back in with any comments or reflections based on the chat and what people have said so far in the discussion.
No, I mean, I think that it seems that we're all looking in the same direction of following this introductory webinar up with concrete actions, and I've heard a lot of things that I think can be next steps towards this vision that Alice and Siddharth so beautifully illustrated for us at the beginning. So I am optimistic.
That's good. That gave me a little chance to find the link to the PCST constitution as well, which I have posted in the chat there for everyone to see. And that is the governance document for how PCST runs. So I think it's really important that all members of PCST are aware of that and see how decisions are made for the network and who makes them. So I've posted that in the chat as well. So I think this seems like a good time to sum up. I imagine as I start doing that, we will get some more comments in the chat. But there's a few things that I have noted down in terms of actions. I think the first action is relating to the statement itself and reflecting on some of the comments that were made within this webinar about what should be included in that statement. So I think that's the first action that we have to take forward. The next one is related to the code of conduct for the conference and making sure that's available, and also a way in which we evaluate that as part of our conference evaluation. I think that would be good to look at that and have a further discussion about what role it played and where the gaps are or what was missing. That's said the same thing twice there. The other thing is then the opportunity for a working group for PCST to look at this as a focus, and I think that would be important to raise at the first kind of meeting of the new scientific committee, perhaps, in terms of discussing how that could be taken forward, because that's where the members of the different subcommittees are decided and brought. Although it might be that could be discussed at the AGM itself. Maybe that's a conversation we need to have, Alice, to see if that needs to be brought there, because just to mention the Constitution, there's certain ways in which that can be changed if it needs to be changed, and one of those is by raising things at the AGM, because members have to vote on certain changes that are made to the Constitution. And I think that was, oh, the other one was around the webinars and opportunities to create connections and networking going forward around those. Was that everything? Did I miss anything out there? Please let me know if I did. And this should be recorded as well. Nope, I think if there is anything else that people reflect on after this webinar as well, please do share the webinars. Yeah, the suggestions can be made for webinars as well, so that is great. And like I said, there'll be a new well, half a new scientific committee coming in for PCST as well, so they'll be keen to hear views from members of the PCST community too about what they think PCST should be doing. I did mention the AGM that will take place in Rotterdam. If you are able to be there in Rotterdam at the conference and are interested more around these decision-making procedures, then I'd really recommend attending the AGM, because you can see there all the discussion and bring up any points and questions at that AGM too. So I would recommend that. And finally, I want to thank all of our fantastic panelists and speakers today. Thank you particularly to Alice and Siddharth for bringing this topic forward and creating the kind of the initial steps for having this discussion based around the statement that was created. So thank you all very much. And as I mentioned, if you've missed any of it, this will be all recorded and available on YouTube as well. So you can watch it back, because there were a lot of really important points made. And I think sometimes it's also worth re-listening to these conversations again to pick up on just everything, because there is so much that needs to be discussed. So thank you all very much. I'm going to take myself off spotlight now, so that everyone can maybe see each other. And if you wish to give each other away, then you can do, but please be aware that this is being recorded. I can't work out how to take myself off spotlight now. Anna, I don't know if you can help take me off spotlight so that we can see everybody else. There we go. So if people want
everyone.
To say bye, and thank you all so much.
Thanks so
Bye,
much
everyone.
Bye.
Lovely to see you all.